The Apex Club was a cathedral built to the god of money, and its silence was the most expensive thing in the city. It existed on the 95th floor of the Croft Tower, a spire of obsidian glass that stabbed at the clouds. Inside, the air was chilled to the precise temperature of indifference. Marble floors, polished to a black mirror, reflected the diamond and sapphire constellations of the city below. The chandeliers were not merely light fixtures. They were frozen explosions of crystal, each shard gleaming like a shard of ice. The scent in the air was a carefully curated blend of old leather, expensive perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of immense, untouchable wealth. This was a place where gravity felt different, where the weight of $1 billion pressed down on the velvet cushions and made whispers sound like shouts. At the center of this opulent void, commanding the best view, sat Julian Croft. He was a man assembled from sharp angles and expensive materials. His suit was a whisper of Italian wool, so dark it seemed to drink the light. The watch on his wrist was a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, its quiet ticking a countdown of moments that each cost more than a family's car. His face was handsome in the way a predator is handsome, all clean lines and cold efficiency. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the room not with interest, but with the weary appraisal of a king surveying possessions he had long grown tired of. Julian's world was a fortress of his own making, its walls built of stock portfolios and leveraged buyouts. He believed in a simple, brutal arithmetic. A person's worth was a number, written in black ink on a balance sheet. Anything that could not be quantified, kindness, dignity, sorrow, was a liability. It was a philosophy that had made him a titan, and it had hollowed him out completely, leaving behind a perfect, gilded shell. He wasn't looking at the city. His gaze was fixed on the object that dominated the private dining room, a massive, intricate architectural model. It was a miniature of the building that would soon supplant this one as his monument, the Eleanor Tower. It was to be his legacy, a tribute to his late wife, a structure of impossible grace and soaring ambition. And it was wrong. A flaw, a tiny, infuriating imperfection in the sweep of a primary support arch, gnawed at him. It was a discordant note in his symphony of power, and it made his blood run cold. Moving through this frozen landscape of wealth was Ilara Vance. She was a waitress, and in the Apex Club, that made her functionally invisible. Her uniform was a simple, stark black dress, impeccably clean, but worlds away from the couture that surrounded her. Her shoes were soft-soled and sensible, designed for silent, endless motion. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was its own form of grace, refilling water glasses that gleamed like sculpted ice and clearing plates with hands that were steady and sure. Ilara wore her past like a shadow she could never outrun. It was a tragedy that had stripped her of her dreams and left her in this high-altitude purgatory, serving men who would not remember her name 2 seconds after she left their table. But beneath the quiet resignation, there was a core of unyielding dignity. Her eyes, a warm, deep brown, missed nothing. She saw the nervous tick of the junior executive and the lonely sadness in the eyes of the billionaire's wife. She saw the subtle cracks in the perfect facades of the powerful, and she saw the flaw in the model. She saw it the moment they wheeled it in. It wasn't just a mistake in calculation. It was a failure of imagination. The arch, meant to convey effortless strength, instead suggested a subtle, structural anxiety. It was a building holding its breath, afraid to exhale. The sight of it sent a familiar ache through her, a phantom limb of a life she once had, a world of blueprints and stress diagrams, of shared dreams drawn on napkins in late-night diners. A world she had shared with her husband, Liam, before it was all taken away. Julian's voice, when it came, was ice wrapped in velvet. "It's wrong," he said, not to anyone in particular, but to the model itself, as if accusing it of a personal betrayal. His team of architects, men with degrees from the best schools and fees to match, stood around him, their faces pale and tight. "Mr. Croft," the lead architect began, his voice trembling slightly. "The load-bearing calculations are sound. It's an unconventional design, but it will hold." "I don't care if it will hold," Julian snapped, his voice cutting through the reverential hush of the room. "It looks weak. It looks afraid. This tower is not meant to be afraid." He gestured dismissively, a flick of his wrist that erased millions of dollars of work. In his frustration, his hand brushed against a delicate strut on the model. A tiny, laser-cut piece of acrylic detached and clattered onto the marble floor. The sound was as loud as a gunshot. The room froze. The architects stared at the fallen piece as if it were a severed finger. Julian's face darkened with a rage that was cold and absolute. It was the fury of a god whose creation had dared to be imperfect. Ilara felt a pull, an instinct she had suppressed for years. It was the designer's instinct, the problem solver's urge to make things right. She saw the solution in her mind's eye, a clean, elegant fix that would not only correct the structural weakness, but transform it into the building's most breathtaking feature. For a moment, she was back in the small studio with Liam, the smell of graphite and paper filling the air, the shared excitement of a puzzle solved. She took a step forward. It was a small movement, but in the charged silence of the Apex Club, it was an earthquake. Every eye in the room turned to her. For the first time all night, she was no longer invisible. She was a disruption, an anomaly in their perfect, ordered world. Julian Croft's gaze fell upon her, and it was like being pinned by a shard of ice. His eyes held no recognition, only a flat, contemptuous dismissal. He saw not a person, but an object out of place, a servant who had forgotten her role. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. She had been silent for so long, drowning in the quiet grief of her loss. But this was a desecration of something she and Liam had held sacred, the integrity of a good design. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent room. I think I see the problem." A beat of stunned silence. Then Julian Croft threw his head back and laughed. It was not a sound of humor or joy. It was a cruel, barking noise, sharp and metallic, the sound of a vault door slamming shut on the very idea of compassion. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, a public declaration of her absurdity. "You?" he sneered, his lips curling into a smile as thin as a paper cut. "A waitress? You see the problem with a $10 million architectural model?" He turned to the room, a performer playing to his audience. The crowd of wealthy patrons, who had been watching with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity, now relaxed into smirks and quiet chuckles. They were on familiar ground again. The natural order was being restored. The help was being put in her place. "What do you see, little waitress?" Julian continued, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Is the tiny chandelier not straight? Is there a smudge on one of the miniature windows?" Ilara stood her ground, her face pale, but her expression resolute. The humiliation washed over her, hot and sharp, but something else rose to meet it. a defiant spark of the woman she used to be. The woman who had debated structural dynamics with professors and who could see the soul of a building in its lines. "It's the tensile strength of the cantilever," she said, her voice clearer now, stronger. "You're relying on compressive strength alone, but the curve of the arch creates a lateral torsion stress that the current design doesn't account for. It's not just that it looks weak. It is weak." The technical terms, spoken with such quiet confidence, hung in the air, utterly alien in the mouth of a waitress. The laughter in the room faltered, replaced by a confused murmur. Julian's smile tightened. For a person of her station to possess such knowledge was not impressive. It was an impertinence. He decided to escalate the humiliation, to make an example of her that would be talked about for weeks. He stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look up at him. "A regular expert, are we?" he purred, the words a silken threat. "All right then. Let's make this interesting." He swept his arm out, a grand, theatrical gesture encompassing the model, the room, the entire city visible through the panoramic windows. "I'll make you a deal, waitress," he announced, his voice booming with performative magnanimity. "If you can fix my $10 million mistake, if you can solve this lateral torsion stress with your profound wisdom." He paused for dramatic effect, a cruel twinkle in his eyes. "I'll give you the contract to design the whole damn building." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a preposterous, impossible wager. It was a king offering his kingdom to a peasant for correctly guessing the number of beans in a jar. It was the ultimate act of public mockery, designed to crush her so completely that she would simply turn and flee. He expected her to stammer, to apologize, to shrink back into the invisibility from which she had so foolishly emerged. The audience watched, holding their breath. They were rapt, witnessing a spectacle of pure, distilled cruelty. This was better than any theater. A life was about to be broken for their entertainment. But Ilara did not break. A profound calm settled over her. The fear, the humiliation, the years of quiet servitude, it all burned away, leaving behind a single, focused point of light. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the grieving widow, the invisible waitress. She was Ilara Vance, the architect, Liam's partner, the one who remembered everything. She met Julian Croft's icy gaze without flinching. "All right," she said, a single word. It dropped into the silence like a stone into a frozen lake, cracking the surface of his arrogance. The smug certainty on Julian's face wavered for a fraction of a second. This was not part of the script. Ilara turned from him and walked toward the model. The crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. Her simple black dress seemed, in that moment, more dignified than all the silk and jewels in the room. She ignored the whispers, the stares, the palpable shock that radiated from the onlookers. She knelt beside the intricate model, her focus absolute. The world narrowed to the flawed arch, the elegant lines, the puzzle waiting to be solved. She saw Liam's face in her mind, smiling, encouraging her. "Look past the problem, Ilara," he used to say. "See the solution that's already there." Her hands, which had spent years carrying trays and polishing glasses, moved with an old, familiar precision. She picked up a crisp linen napkin from a nearby table setting. With a few deft folds, she created a rigid, angled form. She then took a long, thin swizzle stick from a discarded cocktail glass. Finally, she asked a stunned busboy for a small piece of tape from the service station, her voice calm and even. She worked quickly, her movements economical and precise. She used the swizzle stick to brace the napkin, creating a lightweight but incredibly strong truss. It was a concept born from years of study, a principle of tension and support that was both ancient and revolutionary. She didn't just patch the broken piece. She completely re-envisioned the support system. She gently inserted her creation into the model's structure. The folded napkin and swizzle stick became a flying buttress, reimagined with modern, minimalist grace. It didn't just support the weak arch, it counterbalanced it, transforming the perceived weakness into an illusion of weightlessness. The arch no longer looked like it was struggling to hold up the tower. It now looked like it was teaching the tower to fly. The entire aesthetic of the building shifted. What had been heavy and anxious was now light, dynamic, and breathtakingly beautiful. It was a single, devastatingly brilliant stroke of genius. She had not just fixed a mistake. She had created a masterpiece. Ilara stood up and stepped back. Silence. A deep, profound, and absolute silence descended upon the Apex Club. It was a silence filled not with tension, but with awe. The patrons, the architects, the staff. Everyone stared at the transformed model, their minds struggling to reconcile the waitress they had dismissed with the artist who stood before them. The cruel smirks had vanished, replaced by open-mouthed disbelief. Julian Croft stood frozen, his face a mask of shock. The color had drained from his cheeks. He stared at the model, then at Ilara, then back at the model. His mind, a finely tuned machine for calculating profit and loss, short-circuited. He could not process what he was seeing. He saw the napkin and the swizzle stick, absurdly mundane objects, but he also saw the sublime perfection of the design they had created. He understood, with a sickening, plummeting certainty, that what she had done in 30 seconds with table scraps was something his entire team of world-renowned architects had failed to do in 2 years, with a budget of millions. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it shattered and reformed in an instant. Julian Croft, the king in his castle, was suddenly a spectator. Ilara Vance, the invisible servant, was now the center of gravity, her quiet confidence an unassailable fortress. The room, which had been his stage, was now hers. "My God," a voice whispered from the crowd, breaking the spell. It was an older gentleman, impeccably dressed, who had been watching the entire exchange with a keen, unreadable expression. He stepped forward, his eyes alight with an electrifying combination of shock and discovery. This was Mr. Sterling, the primary investor in the Eleanor Tower, a man whose quiet nod could make or break fortunes. He ignored Julian completely. His focus was entirely on Ilara. "Young woman," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "that is extraordinary." He then turned to the man standing beside him, a distinguished figure with wild gray hair and spectacles perched on his nose. "Professor Finch, what are your thoughts?" Professor Alistair Finch, the most feared and respected architectural critic in the world, stepped forward as if in a trance. He had come as Sterling's guest, expecting a night of tedious corporate glad-handing. Instead, he was witnessing a miracle. He peered at the model, adjusting his glasses, his expression one of intense, scholarly concentration. It's a tensegrity-based cantilever," he breathed, his voice filled with a reverence usually reserved for ancient cathedrals. "The way she's used a simple truss to redistribute the load is not just structurally sound. It's poetic. It transforms the building's entire narrative. It's not about support anymore. It's about aspiration." He looked at Ilara, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. This isn't just a fix. This is a paradigm shift. Who are you? The question hung in the air. Julian Croft's world, A world built on the unshakable foundation of his own superiority began to crumble. The murmurs in the room grew louder, no longer derisive, but buzzing with the implications of what they had just seen. A video, surreptitiously filmed on a patron's phone, was already being uploaded. The story of the billionaire and the waitress was about to escape the 95th floor and go viral. Julian's reputation, as solid and imposing as his tower, was about to become a joke. Sterling's gaze finally fell upon Julian, and it was as cold and unforgiving as a glacier. "Julian," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you made a promise, in front of all of my associates, in front of Professor Finch. You made a promise." Julian couldn't speak. The words were trapped in his throat, choked by a toxic cocktail of humiliation and disbelief. His entire worldview had been predicated on the idea that value was expensive, that genius came with a pedigree. The woman standing before him, in her simple uniform, had just demolished that worldview with a napkin and a stick. He was escorted from the main dining room by Sterling, not with force, but with a quiet, damning pressure that was far more effective. The architects he had berated now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He had not only been wrong, he had been cruel in his wrongness, and he had done it in the most public way imaginable. His phone began to vibrate incessantly in his pocket. Calls from his board, from the media, from a world that was just now learning of his colossal, arrogant mistake. Stripped of his audience and his armor of arrogance, Julian was led to a small, private office. The silence here was different. It was not the silence of power, but the silence of a vacuum. Sterling closed the door, his face grim. "You have created a disaster, Julian. Not for the project. That woman may have just saved it. But for yourself. The board is already calling for an emergency meeting. Your behavior was not just unbecoming. It was a catastrophic liability." Julian finally found his voice, a raw, ragged thing. It was a joke, a stupid joke. "She didn't take it as a joke," Sterling countered, his voice sharp. "And neither did I. You publicly wagered the design contract for a $2 billion project. You will honor it. But that is the least of your problems right now. Your first task is to go back out there, find that woman, and you will apologize. Then you will find out who she is and how you can possibly begin to make this right." The command was absolute. Julian, the titan of industry, had been reduced to a chastened schoolboy. The foundation of his identity, his power, his infallibility, had been pulverized. After her shift ended, long after the Apex Club had emptied of its shocked patrons, Ilara sat in a small, 24-hour cafe miles from the glittering spire of the Croft Tower. The air smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant, a world away from the curated perfection of her workplace. She was nursing a cup of tea, her hands still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of coming back to life. Julian found her there. He had changed out of his suit into a simple sweater, a pathetic attempt to shed the skin of the man he had been just hours before. He looked smaller, diminished, the cold fire in his eyes banked to a dull ember. He approached her table hesitantly. "Miss, Vance," he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He had never bothered to learn it before. Ilara looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. She did not offer him a seat. I came to apologize," he stammered. "What I did, what I said, there is no excuse for it." "No," she agreed quietly. "There isn't." The simple, unadorned truth of her statement left him with nowhere to hide. He was forced to stand there, exposed and humbled. Desperate to explain, to make sense of the wreckage of his evening, He began to speak. "The tower," he said, his voice cracking slightly. It was for my wife, Eleanor. She passed away 2 years ago." He finally sat, uninvited, the words spilling out of him as if a dam had broken. He spoke of Eleanor, of her love for architecture, of her belief that buildings could be more than just steel and glass. They could be poetry. He confessed that the tower had become a frantic, obsessive attempt to build a monument to a memory, a way to keep her from fading away completely. "My grief," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the scarred tabletop. "It made me hard. I thought if I could control everything, build everything, own everything, I could somehow wall off the pain. I saw people as instruments, pawns. I became a man my wife would have hated." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate plea for understanding. "When I saw the flaw in the model, it felt like I was failing her all over again, and I took that failure out on you." Ilara listened, her expression softening. The arrogant tyrant from the Apex Club had vanished, replaced by a man drowning in a sea of his own making. His pain, she realized with a jolt, felt familiar. It was a different vintage, aged in wealth instead of poverty, but it was the same sorrow she lived with every day. Moved by a sudden, unexpected empathy, she decided to share her own story. "I understand," she said softly. "More than you know." She told him about Liam. She spoke of his brilliance, his passion, the way he could see entire cityscapes in the grain of a piece of wood. She described their tiny apartment, overflowing with books and blueprints, their shared dream of starting their own firm. She told him about the accident, a senseless, random tragedy involving a drunk driver that had stolen him from her and shattered their future into 1,000,000 pieces. "I didn't just lose my husband," she explained, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I lost my partner. I lost my nerve. The world of architecture was our world. Without him, I couldn't bear to be in it. So I hid. I took a job where no one would see me, where I could just disappear." She reached into her worn handbag and pulled out a small, tattered sketchbook. It was filled with Liam's drawings and hers. She opened it to a random page. On the page was a series of sketches, elegant and fluid, exploring the very same concept she had demonstrated with the napkin and swizzle stick. It was a design for a floating truss system, an idea Liam had been obsessed with before he died. Julian's eyes widened as he looked at the drawing. A strange, chilling sense of recognition washed over him. "What was his full name?" Julian asked, his voice a choked whisper. "Liam Vance," she replied. Julian felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He reached into his own wallet, his hands shaking. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn and creased from being carried for 2 years. It was a printout from a website. He unfolded it and placed it on the table next to her sketchbook. It was a page from an online portfolio for an unknown, up-and-coming architectural designer. It featured a series of breathtakingly original concepts. At the top of the page was the name, Liam Vance. "The night Eleanor died," Julian said, his voice breaking. She was so excited. She had found this young architect online. She said he was the future, that he designed with soul. She printed this out to show me. She wanted us to hire him, to give him a chance to build something real. He tapped the paper. "This. She wanted me to meet your husband." The revelation struck them both with the force of a physical blow. It was a coincidence so profound, so cruelly perfect, that it could only be destiny. Their separate, private tragedies were not separate at all. They were two ends of the same tangled, broken thread. Julian's monument to his dead wife was inspired by the work of Ilara's dead husband. His act of cruel mockery had been directed at the one person in the world who held the missing piece of his wife's final dream. The weight of it was crushing. Julian Croft, the man who believed he controlled the universe, was shown in one gut-wrenching moment that he was nothing but a pawn in a story far larger and more tragic than he could have ever imagined. His cruelty was not just an insult to a waitress. It was a profound betrayal of Eleanor's last wish. He finally understood. The universe hadn't been punishing him. It had been trying to send him a message, and he had been too arrogant, too blind with grief and power to see it. He looked at Ilara, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not a servant, but the living legacy of the genius his wife had recognized. He saw the keeper of the flame he had been trying to honor in the most clumsy, ignorant way possible. In the sterile quiet of the late-night cafe, Julian Croft broke. The icy fortress he had built around his heart melted away, and he wept. He wept for his wife, for the man he had become, and for the terrible, beautiful irony that had brought him to this table. He was stripped of everything, his pride, his power, his certainty. And in that empty space, for the first time in years, something new had room to grow. He was faced with a choice. He could crumble into ruin, or he could atone. The next day, Julian Croft called a press conference. The story had already become a media sensation, painting him as the ultimate villain. He walked to the podium, not with his usual swagger, but with the measured, somber steps of a changed man. He did not make excuses. He did not minimize his actions. He told the world the entire story. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, and her dream. He spoke of Liam Vance, the brilliant young architect she had admired. And then he introduced Ilara Vance, not as the waitress he had humiliated, but as his new partner. "I made a promise," he announced, his voice steady and clear, "and I will honor it. But the original promise is no longer sufficient. Miss Vance will not simply be given a contract. She will be the lead architect and a full partner on this project. Furthermore, the tower will be renamed. It will no longer be the Eleanor Tower. It will be the Vance Croft Tower, a monument to two brilliant minds and a testament to the power of second chances." But he didn't stop there. He announced the formation of a new, multi-billion-dollar charitable foundation. The Eleanor and Liam Foundation, he declared, will be dedicated to funding scholarships for underprivileged and overlooked students of architecture. We will find the geniuses that the world has made invisible, and we will give them the chance they deserve. He turned to Ilara, who stood beside him, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the flash of the cameras. "And Miss Vance has graciously agreed to chair the Foundation's selection committee. She will be the one to find them." It was a grand gesture of atonement, so stunning in its scope that it silenced all criticism. He was not just making amends. He was building a new legacy from the ashes of his old one. He was using his immense wealth not to build a wall around his pain, but to build a bridge for others. Ilara, in turn, was given the ultimate empowerment. She was lifted from invisibility and placed in a position of immense power and influence, given the resources to ensure no one with a dream like hers and Liam's would ever have to hide again. 3 years passed. The Vance Croft Tower was complete. It did not stab at the sky like Julian's old tower. It soared. Ilara's design had transformed it into a breathtaking spectacle of light and air. The flying buttress, born from a napkin and a swizzle stick, was its signature feature, a symbol of impossible grace made real. It was hailed by critics as the most important piece of architecture of the new century. It was not a cold monument to a single man's ego, but a vibrant, collaborative masterpiece that seemed to breathe with the city itself. On the observation deck, a public space filled with students and tourists, stood Ilara and Julian. Ilara was no longer the invisible waitress. She was a celebrated architect, confident and serene, her name synonymous with innovation and artistry. Julian was quieter now, humbled. The sharp, predatory angles of his face had softened. He had stepped down as CEO of his company, pouring all his energy into the foundation. He found more satisfaction in reviewing a student's portfolio than he ever had in a corporate takeover. They stood together in comfortable silence, a friendship forged in the crucible of shared loss and profound redemption. They were not lovers, nor colleagues in the traditional sense. They were partners in memory, guardians of a legacy that belonged to Eleanor and Liam. "He would have loved this view," Ilara said softly, looking out at the sprawling city. "She would have loved your building," Julian replied, his voice filled with a quiet, peaceful gratitude. "She always said that the best buildings weren't made of steel and glass. She said they were made of stories." He looked at the tower, his tower, which was no longer his alone. "I tried to build a monument out of cold ambition, something to hide my pain behind. You taught me that true legacies aren't built to hide our wounds. They're built to heal them." Below them, a group of young scholarship students from the Eleanor and Liam Foundation were excitedly pointing out landmarks, their faces bright with hope and possibility. They were the true legacy. They were the story that would continue long after the steel had aged and the glass had weathered. The final moral summation of their journey was not delivered in a grand speech, but in that quiet, shared moment. It was a truth they had both learned in the most painful way possible, that a person's true worth is not measured by the height of the walls they build around themselves, but by the number of doors they open for others. True wealth was not in a bank account, but in the currency of kindness, the dividend of a second chance, and the unbreakable bond of a shared humanity.